Ah, well, hello there. Okay, so let's continue on with our lecture on race and racism. And one of the things that I want to sort of admit here is that this is kind of more of like a history lesson about um, sort of colonialism and racism and talking about slavery and stuff like that. The reason why we're doing this is because for us as social scientists, for anthropologists, for us to understand our concepts of other cultures and their ideas about race, their ideas about ethnicity and culture, well, all of it comes from our own experience. And that's important to recognize is that our experience, our bias, and our bias is our experience as a culture, our generational knowledge, right? All of that is important to think about and recognize, to reflect upon when we're looking at other cultures and other communities to try and understand how they have persisted, how they have lived in their communities. How do we see them depends greatly upon how we see ourselves. And so having that historical knowledge helps us to understand that. Okay, so let's continue on. So, as many more people, and we kind of discussed a little bit about this, as many people arrive to the United States from other countries, right, that concept of race hadn't been completely finalized, right? What is white, right? Is it white skin? Well, if you look at the Chinese, they have same pigment, but different ethnicity, different facial structure, right? We see those differences, and we look at them and we're like, well, yeah, pale skin, sure, but are they white? Are they white enough? Do they fit in that? And culturally, things were then created to be different. Now it had to be European, that European white skin. But even then, again, like the Germans or the Scots or the Irish, when they came over to the United States initially, they were not considered to be white. They were considered to be a different race, right? They were not a part of um, what was considered white. And then we start seeing this concept of like nativism, right? And nativism is something that we still experience today. This hasn't gone away, but it's about culture, right? We might have the same skin tone, but you're not from here, so you'll never be like me. You'll never have that connection as being an American. And of course, those first generations, there were differences. They were bringing over their own culture, but within subsequent generations, everyone ends up being relatively similar because they adapt to that culture. So we started seeing this concept of nativism taking place. Um, and even to a certain extent, we see that here in Colorado, right? Not to the same sort of degree, but there's an essence that still exists. Even like you might see the car, like a bumper sticker on a car, and it says native on it, right? Like you're a Colorado native. And that somehow gives you permission to, claim that you're better than someone else that moved here recently. And that's essentially what that is, right? You are claiming to claiming to have claim to this land, to this culture and community. I am native. So, right, there's still a part of that we still experience, um, and that's in some degrees natural, and in a lot of ways it's taught. Right, you oftentimes appreciate the place where you're born, you know it, you become a part of it. At the same time, how do you relate to people that are coming here, right? Um, it's an interesting juxtaposition between Americans as we say that America is great and it's wonderful and it's the best country in the world. And when you keep saying that and everybody hears it and they want to become a part of it, and then they come here through that hegemonic force, right, that you're putting out there, we've got the best government and the best rights and the best, entertainment and the best job opportunity. Why wouldn't other people want that as well? But when they get here, there's such a strong resistance to immigrants. There's mixed messaging going on, right? We're the best, but you can't be a part of us. But we want you to know. But don't come here, right? That kind of thing. I think a really interesting movie that, excuse me, that kind of emphasized this was The Gangs of New York. This came out, I think, in the early 2000s. Great story about immigrants coming to the United States and finding their home in New York and what it was like to live there, and sort of had this nativism versus immigrant, right? And what did that mean? How did they experience it? So if you want an interesting movie to watch, not a bad one to do. How did they finally gain their whiteness? Okay, so again, a lot of it takes time. Anytime that you're dealing with cultural change, we're talking about sometimes generations of people have to exist before that social and cultural change actually takes place. So a lot of it had to do with people intermarrying each other. You're living in the same neighborhoods, but this family's German, this family's Swedish. They get married, and all of a sudden, within a couple generations, nobody cares. Right? Those old issues stay old. Not that they disappear, as we will talk about, but it changes over time. So a lot of it had to deal with, again, sort of that that generational change, gaining upward mobility, getting good jobs, marrying into multiple families, and then eventually changing how that concept was actually looked at. So these were some of the things that immigrating families coming from Europe would have faced, and it's certainly not to discount what would have happened to Europeans and the struggles that they had. But comparatively, if we were to compare it to slavery, again, this is apples and oranges, right? They can't necessarily be compared. How do we look at the Middle East, right? This is the birthplace of the Judeo-Christian Muslim heritage, right? Religious heritage. So culturally, a lot of where we come from actually stems from this area. Part of our language, our alphabet, a lot of that has that Arabic historical context. Even the term Caucasian, right, comes from the Caucasus Mountains. And those mountains were a part of Eastern Europe, right? Russia, India, Azerbaijan, Georgia, all of those countries right there had that cultural mix of immigrants going from one place to another. So it was a very diverse area for trade and for religion and for culture. And a lot of that moved into Europe, right? From the Arabic countries to Eastern Europe into Europe. There's really not a lot of distance between those countries. I mean, we're not talking thousands of miles. We're talking hundreds of miles between some of those places, right? If we think about even like the Crusades, right? You had folks that were traveling overland to get to the Middle East from France and from Great Britain, from those kingdoms, to get to these places to fight those wars. You didn't have to cross a sea, right? You could You could walk there. So some of those terms come from there. But now, right, when we think about the Middle East, we oftentimes associate it with religious ideology, right? We connect it to Islam, even though Islam is a part of that same tradition of Judaism and Christianity, including after Islam, we have Baha'i, right? I think there's only about 6 million, I think it's about 6 million people that actually practice Baha'i. But it falls into that same sort of religious tradition of sort of that Judeo concept of God, right? And how it's been passed down from generation to generation to create new religions. But they're all related, right? Islam still talks about Jesus, right? It actually mentions Jesus in the Quran, right? And his mother, Mary, right? She's a huge figure in Islam. They're still there, right? It's still all connected, just some different practices. So the Middle East has a huge influence, but now, right, because of those cultural differences, and especially when we focus or hyper-focus onto religious differences, we start seeing big issues. And that's not to say that there aren't big issues when we look at terrorism. But the question to ask is, why is that terrorism taking place? If we go back in time, even to like the 1960s, Iran was a sort of a hotbed for democracy, right? It was a cultural and educational place where people could go and learn, and it was pretty amazing. And then religious ideologies took over, and theologists took over and changed the rules. And any country could be exposed to this. It just so happened that it happened there. And there's, again, this could be another entire course that we could talk about, but understanding how that relates to us now, right? And how certain events might change those things, right? If we go back in time to 9/11, right? Yeah, that was 20 some odd years ago, but it had a huge impact on how we view the Middle East, because then we went to war. We went to this war with this nebulous idea of what terrorism is, but is terrorism a country? Is terrorism a religion? Is terrorism a culture, right? And so even thinking about how we define a group of people, that culture, it's connected to all of these different things. And so how do we distinguish that? How to reinforce the idea of going to war with a people, right? If we're talking about making that decision to go to a war, how do you get the people to support it? What are the things that you have to say to not only motivate to keep that war going, but to justify it ethically? These are questions that we would look for. If I were to do a study on 9/11, I might go out and talk to veterans, right? What did you experience there, right? Were you on the front line? What did that front line look like? How did you interact with the population there? This wasn't like a World War II or Vietnam style war. There were no trenches, right? It was a totally new way of doing things. How does the population in Afghanistan feel about it on an individual level, on a cultural level? What are the things that they saw change? What have they seen as things have changed as the United States and the UN have left Afghanistan? What has happened since? Right, so we want to ask those questions, and we would use questions like race, like religion, and ask about those influences. So right? When we think about the Middle East, how does that impact the people here in the United States, right? We saw a lot of racial tension and racial profiling on folks that looked Middle Eastern, right? Even if they weren't Muslim, people didn't know the difference between a Muslim and a Sikh. And so you had Sikhs that were being targeted, that were being harassed, were being beaten up or brutalized. Even though they don't have the religion, they might not have been in that country for generations, right? How do we try to understand what's going on? Okay, what about Asia? Okay, if we look at the Far East, right? If we look at China, if we look at Japan and Korea and Vietnam and all of those, that part of the world, which is a massive part of the world, um, how do they how are they portrayed in American culture, right? How do we see them? How do they see us, right? If we go back in time and we start seeing a large influence of um, Asians in general, and that's a very generalized term, um, when they started coming to the United States as it became easier to travel, right? We had a lot of Chinese that came to the United States during the gold rush, right? California in 1949 saw a huge um, gold rush take place, and there was all kinds of money, and they needed more and more people to go out and create the infrastructure, right? A lot of Chinese were brought over and helped create the first intercontinental railroad system from the East Coast to the West Coast. They were used as miners. They were used as laborers. Um, and even up until the Civil War. And of course, they didn't have the same rights. A lot of them were indentured servants. But the Civil War took place as slavery was ended, and you had an exodus from the South as African Americans were moving away from there, going to other parts of the country. You started seeing an influx moving into the South of Chinese laborers. Still considered secondhand citizens, certainly not considered to be, white or voting class or anything like that. So, they filled in sort of a new position, right? Then we have World War II take place, right? And this changed a lot about how we as a country saw Japan, saw China, saw all of these Asian countries, and it really expressed how we see it because we did something that the Germans also did. We created intern camps, right? So we have these Japanese intern camps that existed within the United States. In fact, in Colorado, we had one, the Grenada War Relocation Center, right? And this is down not too far away from Lyman, right? Just southeast of there. Not too far away from the Colorado-Kansas border. And we started shipping, and what would happen is they would go out and they would arrest Japanese immigrants, and some of these immigrants had been here for generations, right? Had established themselves as Americans, had homes, had businesses, and put them into camps, right? Up to the point where there was 120,000 people that were placed in these camps. Even, and I think this is really important to kind of remember, is that, we oftentimes look at this as history, but this is living history, right? I don't know if any of you guys are Star Trek fans. George Takei, who was Sulu on the original Star Trek, right, of Japanese ancestry. Him and his parents were placed in one of these internment camps, right? He lived there as a small child. That is living history, right? That isn't something that happened in generations past. This person is still alive. George Takei is still out there talking about it. In fact, he even did a musical about the experience of the Japanese in the internment camps. And he did it because he had firsthand knowledge, right? So it's important to recognize those things. Interesting side note, because I'm a huge Star Wars fan and Star Trek fan. In the prequel series, there's an event that takes place, Order 66. Okay, Order 66 was when the Emperor comes out and says, engage Order 66, whatever, and all the Jedi are killed, right? George Lucas took that concept of Order 66 directly from this instance. The Executive Order 9066 that was enacted by President Roosevelt. That was an executive order to gather all of the Japanese and to put them into these internment camps. That's where that was inspired from, right? Taking that bit of history and incorporating it into modern storytelling, right? And I think it's important to recognize that there is that history there, to see that, to understand that that is living history, right? So yeah, when we think about what it was like for these folks to live through this experience, that we had intern camps. We talked about even like the boarding schools. Boarding schools could be considered intern camps, right? Effectively doing the same thing, except for with just kids, just children, right? Changing them, teaching them, trying to turn them into something that they weren't originally. Something to consider. Okay, we're going to pause there and then we'll continue on with our next segment.